Oh, come on. Good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
We are living in exciting times, and I got an opportunity to share some of the interesting things taking place in Europe at the moment. Victor Hugo was a French poet, and in 1849 at the Peace Congress in Paris, he spoke these words. He said, "A day will come when all nations on our continent will form a European brotherhood. A day will come when we shall see the United States of America and the United States of what? Europe. Face to face, reaching out for each other across the seas." 1849, this man made this speech in Paris. Today, we live in a time where we see those very words, they appear to be fulfilled. We see a United States of Europe. We call it the European Union. But today, as you'd be very much aware, we are asking ourselves the question, will it remain united or will it divide? To understand this, we're going to rewind a little bit and look at some history. Jean Monnet was born in 1888 in France. He was an excellent mind when it came to social politics and economics. At the age of 16, he left school, moved to London, joined the family business in international trade and commerce. You could do that back then when you were 16 years of age. At the time when he was 26, World War I broke out in Europe. And when it broke out, he was convinced at the age of 26, the only way to win this war against the Germans was if the French and the British united economic resources. He went to the French premier and convinced him of this. They formed a relationship with Britain, and as a result, today, many historians believe it was because of Jean Monnet that the effort of World War I was as successful as it turned out. In 1919, they had another peace conference, also in Paris, but at this conference, this is just after World War I had ended, at this peace conference, Jean Monnet, along with the Minister for Economic Trade from France, proposed to this group of people that they should form a new world order based on economics in the European region. Later that year, at the age of about 31, he was elected as the Deputy General Secretary of the League of Nations, which later became known as the United Nations. But 20 years later, World War II broke out in Europe. And this was a great disappointment to Jean Monnet. He wrote this when he was elected to a reconciliation council right before the end of World War II, and he spoke this at that conference. He said, "There will be no peace in Europe if the states are reconstituted on the basis of national sovereignty. The countries of Europe are too small to guarantee their peoples the necessary prosperity and social development. The European states must constitute themselves into what? Into a federation." He then says, "The way to build a new union is through incremental steps toward economic integration that will one day lead to political integration." In 1915, Monnet was instrumental in getting the French and the Germans to unite and build the European coal and steel community. This was the ground being laid for the European Union. In 1961, Time magazine recognized Jean Monnet as the father of Europe because he was the one that brought these countries together economically. And in 1993, this organization was renamed into and reconstructed into the European Union. If we fast forward from 1993, very quickly we end up in 1999, the introduction of the Eurodollar. The Eurodollar's goal was to bring a single currency to the European states in order to bring unity. But within 10 years of that currency being introduced, we started to see what is being called the Eurozone crisis. In 2009 through to 2011, there were the massive bailouts to the smaller European countries of Greece and Ireland and Portugal. as they were trying to adapt to this new euro currency, the economics that was behind that, the unemployment, and so on. The second phase of the Eurozone crisis went from 2011 through to 2012, and it affected the larger countries now of Italy and of Spain. Pretty much the same reasons. At this point, the governments of Europe, as you'd be familiar with, they introduced austerity measures, which is a fancy way of saying we're going to increase taxes and we're going to reduce spending. This caused a whole wave of protests, the anti-austerity protests, which today can still be seen in a lot of the European states. In 2015, I don't know if you remember this, but Greece was about to exit the European Union, and they started calling it Grexit. Long before there was a Brexit, there was a Grexit, but it actually didn't take place because France and Germany were doing everything they can to try and keep the Greeks still in the European Union. Then there was the migration crisis that faced the European states. In a short period, 1.4 million migrants landed on the European states' shores, and that put great social pressure as well as economic and religious pressure on those states. And as you would all be familiar now, in 2016, Britain voted themselves to leave the European Union. Today, many people are asking the question, what will the future hold for Europe? What will it hold for the rest of the economic, global economy? When we look at Europe and the formation of the European Union, it has been forged based on two World War events, World War I and World War II. It was through these the catalysts were made to build the European Union. Now, from my perspective as someone who researches these sorts of topics of social politics and history and archaeology and these sorts of things, it's been fascinating to dig into these two events and how both of these events share a common link that perhaps holds the key to the question that I asked at the beginning. Will the European Union stay united or will it divide? Let's have a look at the origin of World War I very quickly. World War I's flashpoint was with the death of this man, Franz Ferdinand. He was an Austro-Hungarian crown prince, but he was assassinated in 1914 in an open car parade through Sarajevo. It was blamed that this assassination was instrumental behind, but the people behind it was the Serbians. They blamed the Serbian red hats, black hats to assassinate this guy here. They blame him for assassinating that. But today history is disputed as to whether or not it was in fact the Serbians. But nonetheless, that's the story that is being told. Now, what happened was when the Serbians were blamed for assassinating the crown prince of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, you can imagine that didn't go down too well. So the Austro-Hungarian Empire declared war on Serbia. Serbia had a very strong alliance with Russia, so Russia jumped in and backed Serbia. But then the Austro-Hungarian Empire, they went to their allies, who were the Germans, and said, hey, you're going to keep our back in this war? And they said, sure. That put the French at odds, which brought the United Kingdom in, and ultimately the United States. This is the textbook story of the flashpoint for World War I. But most people believe that's the flashpoint, but it was this guy that was instrumental behind it. Kaiser Wilhelm II. He was the German emperor. In fact, he was the last German emperor at the time when this whole series of events unwound. He was the grandson of Queen Victoria. So the English and the British were, the English and the Germans were interconnected there through marriage. Now, he had a very strong nationalist agenda that he wanted to see a united Europe under German rule. And so he found that this was an opportunity to initiate that. And so he had massed one of the largest navies at the time and also a massive amount of ground troops. But the interesting connection between World War I and World War II is found in this cathedral, the Metz Cathedral in France. There is a statue there of a guy called the prophet Daniel. This is the same guy that Gary was just talking about with the book. When Kaiser Wilhelm heard about this statue, he made a very unusual statement. He said this. He said, Daniel's prophecy does not fit with my plans. I cannot accept that. Where Charlemagne and others have failed, I will succeed. So in the midst of this beginning of World War I, when they're conquering into the French territories, his generals and things report about this statue, and he cracks up to the point where he then sends a command and says, remove Daniel's head and replace it with mine. Now, if you look closely, you can see there's some discoloration in the face of this statue. That's because it was actually carried out. The question is, why was the Kaiser, the Emperor of Germany, in World War I so adamant that this guy was not going to have his way? Whatever this prophecy was, something about it disturbed him enough to have his face changed. Let's jump to World War II now. Most of you know this guy, Adolf Hitler. He is instrumental in the origins of World War II. The flashpoint there was after the World War I, the League of Nations gave a large portion of territory of the Germans to the Polish. And so he decided, we're going to take that back for German sovereignty, and while we're at it, let's take the rest of Europe as well. I mean, I'm simplifying it, but you get the idea. Now, he gave a speech. Well, he predicted that there'd be 1,000 years of world domination with the Germans uniting Europe. And he gave a speech in 1941 that went this way. He said, my people, we do not need anything from God. We do not ask anything from him except that he may let us alone. We want to fight our own wars with our own guns, without God. We want to gain our victory without the help of God. What is it about Hitler and Kaiser Wilhelm that both of them had some issue with some portion of what we would call today the Bible? Both of them found that there was something about this book that didn't fit in with their plans. They wanted God to stay out of the equation. They said that these prophecies, they don't fit in with our plans. What was it that they are referring to? Because both of these people, instrumental in World War I and World War II, and ultimately which led to the uniting of Europe, both of them had issues with portions of the Bible. If we look at united Europe, many people have tried, and yet every single one of them to this point have failed. And right now it seems like the European Union is about to fail as well. So what was it that they were both so worried about? Who is this Daniel that they had to change the face of the statue? Well, as we heard in Gary's presentation, Daniel is based on a scroll that makes up one of the books of what we would call today the Bible. And Daniel's books, as we've already heard, there is strong evidence to suggest that it was dated at 6 BC or 600 years before the birth of Christ. And these dates are validated in three different areas. With the Dead Sea Scrolls, you heard Gary talking about the Aramaic, which is a style of language, and also a historian called Josephus also dates it to being hand-delivered to some of the early conquerors of his time. So there's no real doubt in archaeological worlds that this book is dated to when it was written. So the question is, what does this book contain that got Kaiser Wilhelm so infuriated about it? Let's have a look. The story's pretty basic. It starts off with a Babylonian captivity. We kind of heard a bit about that already. Daniel is one of the main characters in the story. He gets taken to Babylon by the conquering King Nebuchadnezzar, and King Nebuchadnezzar decides to take some of these wiser people from Jerusalem and train them up to be his own wise men. When we get to the second scene in the chapter, there's a king, this King Nebuchadnezzar. He has a dream. He wakes up. He calls the wise men to come and explain the dream. I don't know if Gary's got any of those dream tablets, the livers and things out there, but they're pretty interesting. And this was a common practice. If the king had a dream, the wise men would come and say, what did you dream? The king would say, this is what I dreamt. And then the wise men would say, oh, well, this is what it means. But in this particular instance, the story goes that the king has a dream. He doesn't remember the dream. And he says to the wise men, you tell me what I dreamt, and then I will believe what it means according to your interpretation. Of course, the wise men can't do that. So he executes a command to have them all put to death. So Daniel, the main character in the story, he comes into it. This is in chapter 2 of the book. And in that, he goes to his God and says, give me the dream so I can tell the king. And according to Daniel, he claims that he had a dream and the God of heaven gave him the answer. Now, I have to tell you something right now. I have been an atheist most of my life. And when I first read this story, this was ludicrous. But I want to share with you something that I find fascinating. When he receives this dream, this is Daniel, who he says is the king's dream, he sees an image of a statue of a man. It has a golden head, it has a metal chest, it has bronze hips, it has legs made of iron and feet made of iron and clay, and the great big rock comes from outer space, comes down, hits the image and breaks into pieces. Daniel gets that dream. He then runs back to the king and he tells the king, this is what you saw. According to the story, the king goes, whoa, that's what I dreamt. Then Daniel has the audacity to say, now let me tell you what it means. He says, this is the dream. Now that's referring to him and God, he's saying, we will tell you the interpretation of it. So very quickly, this is only 140 words, by the way. 140 words tells this whole story that I'm sharing with you. In the interpretation part, Daniel says to the king, he says, there is a God in heaven who reveals secrets, and he has made known to the king Nebuchadnezzar what will be in the latter days. So this is about the future now. So here's an image. According to Daniel, this is telling the future. Now remember, Kaiser Wilhelm, he had an issue with the prophecies of Daniel. And here's what we're talking about. He starts off, Daniel says to the king, he says, you are the head of gold. So that image represents various kingdoms. Remember, it's talking about the end times, the future times. So this golden head represents the stage of the Babylonian Empire. And as you heard from Gary, we know from historical evidence that Babylon came to an end. It doesn't take rocket science to know that. The dream goes on in the interpretation. Daniel says, but after you, so after Babylon, shall arise another kingdom inferior to yours. As we've already heard, on one evening, the fall of Babylon took place with the Medo-Persian Empire. They completely conquered Babylon in one night. It was a very quick invasion. So the Medo-Persians is represented by this second phase of the image, the silver. But then Daniel continues on and he says, then a third kingdom of bronze shall come. We know from history and also within even the own book, the book claims to have predicted that the next empire would be a kingdom called Grecia, which we would call Greece today. And according to history, that's what happened. 331, the Greeks came in, and this is a picture you can go find in the Paris art museum called the Louvre. And this is Alexander the Great entering in as a victor into Babylon. So that those bronze hips and thighs represent the kingdom of Greece. But the prophecy didn't finish there. It went on and said, then a fourth kingdom shall be as strong as iron, as much as iron breaks everything and shatters everything into pieces. We know from world history that the very next empire that came on the scene was that of the Romans. In 168, they wiped out the Greeks and took over as the next dominant world power. But that's not where it finishes. Daniel goes on and says, but that kingdom shall be what? Divided. Notice the language. Up until this point, it has been conquer, 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 but now it's divided. There's a different aspect to it. And one of the greatest puzzles in history is, how did the Roman Empire end? Because it wasn't conquered, it sort of collapsed from within. And it divided into 10 barbaric tribes. And you can see some of the names there, the Ostrogoths, the Heruli, the Franks, and so on. These have made up today the modern states of Europe. So Rome, essentially, the imperial Rome, divided into what today we would know as Europe. But notice what the prophecy says next. It says, as you saw iron mixed with clay, they will mingle with the seed of men, but they will not adhere one to another, just as iron does not mix with clay. Daniel is predicting that when Rome divides, it will divide and it will remain divided. The same way you can't get iron and clay to mix, you're not going to get this kingdom to ever unite again. Absolutely fascinating if you believe it. So in about 140 words, Daniel is claiming, I'm not claiming this, Daniel's claiming this, that he has revealed what would take place, we know today, as being 2,600 years of kingdom history. When you think about this, you are faced with a very serious reality. And that reality is it a hoax? Or is it supernatural? These are the two options you have. Either this is just some really amazing made-up story and it just happens to work out, or the actual chances of this working out may actually suggest there could be something supernatural. After all, who could predict the successive fall of 4 empires, the dividing of one empire, the last empire, and it even mentions it divides to 10. And then it claims that it will never unite again. Kaiser Wilhelm, let's read it again. Daniel's prophecy does not fit with my plans. Kaiser was trying to bring Europe together. Daniel's prophecy was understood before World War I even ended that it wouldn't happen. He says, where others have failed, I will succeed. We have the advantage looking back in history and knowing it didn't succeed. When you look at this image, there are 7 predictive elements. 7 predictive elements. The first one was that, Babylon, and Babylon would fall. The second is Medo-Persia would come along and Medo-Persia would fall. Then Greece would come along, Greece would fall. Rome would come along, Rome would fall. And Rome would divide, and Rome would never unite in the form of divided Europe. But the vision or the dream or the story, whatever you want to refer it to, it ends with one last scene, and that is a great rock that comes and smashes the whole thing, and the rock turns into a mountain and takes over as the last empire. Most people believe, historians and theologians believe, that this rock is referring to God's kingdom. Now, you may not want to accept that or believe it, that's your prerogative, but that's what the internal consistency seems to suggest. So if you put this together now as a mathematical stages, you've got 7 predictive elements. Anybody here into betting? Anybody bet who would win the election last night? I wonder if you got any money. Because everyone that sort of placed a bet publicly kind of got it wrong, didn't they, last night? But here are 7 things. What's the chances of getting 7 predictive elements spot on, in sequence, by name, exactly the way it was foretold? Well, let's have a look. The first one fulfilled. Second one fulfilled, third one fulfilled, fourth one fulfilled, fifth one, you get the idea, the sixth one fulfilled. The last element in this predictive pattern is number 7, and according to that prediction, it's God's kingdom being set up on this earth. And as far as I've noticed, it hasn't happened yet. Are you with me? I mean, we just got a new government last night. It's not God's government. And maybe it is, I don't know. But no, I don't think it's going to take over the whole world though, is it? So this last predictive element is still waiting. But I want to just throw this out to you. If you were a betting person, what do you think the odds are that number 7 will be ticked off just as the previous 6? I don't know what the actual number, 1 in something, would be. I haven't worked it out. It's not my area of speciality. But I'll tell you something. I think it's a pretty safe bet. So far, Kaiser Wilhelm, Adolf Hitler, they had issues with this prophecy. They both predicted, Hitler said, there's 1,000 years of domination coming for Europe and Germany will lead it. Did it happen? I bet you in World War II you thought it might have happened when you see how fast that Nazi party was invading Europe. But according to this, it wouldn't happen. Kaiser Wilhelm, he thought it's going to happen, but it didn't happen. So I leave this with you once again in closing. Either we are dealing with a hoax or perhaps something supernatural. Thank you very much.